As much as this channel is unapologetically dedicated to signal boosting the accomplishments and aspirations of the Biden administration, the Democratic Party, and progressivism in general, we also have an obligation to discuss the bad news, especially so we can course correct before bad becomes worse. And with that in mind, we need to discuss a devastating new poll from the New York Times and Siena College. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, not going to sugarcoat it. Got some bad news here from a very reputable poll, and we're a year out from the election. Okay, so I want to preface this. The election isn't today. That's the good news. The election isn't tomorrow. It's the good news, too. We have a year to course correct, so please keep this in mind. This is not meant to encourage a full-blown panic among liberals and progressives and the Democratic surrogates in general, but basically to get your attention. This is an attention getter. We have to have all hands on deck, and we have to take this seriously. What am I talking about? Well, the New York Times / Siena College released a new poll, and Donald Trump, the multi-indicted, coup attempter, the insurrectionist, the man who wants to shred the Constitution and install himself as an unelected dictator, presumably for life. At this point, we have no reason not to. He is leading in 5 out of 6 critical swing states that Joe Biden won in 2020. And that's not all the bad news. We're not going to read the full article here, but we're going to go through the highlights. Again, not to go through panic or not to instill panic, but just to get your attention. In order to solve a problem, we have to recognize that a problem exists, and we have to probe the depths of the problem. We have to understand the depths of the problem, the extent. Trump is ahead in 5 out of 6 swing states: Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan. President Biden is only up in Wisconsin, and only by 2 percentage points. There's virtually no way to win an election without carrying those swing states. As a reminder, when President Biden won in 2020, yes, he won by like 7 million popular votes, which is great. There was no question that Donald Trump was an unpopular president. The Republican Party hasn't won the popular vote for the presidency except one time in the past 30 years. Democrats are generally more popular, but that's not how we elect a president in this country. Remember, the Electoral College is how you elect the President of the United States. And the only reason that President Biden got his 306 electoral votes to win the Electoral College is because of 44,000 votes in 3 swing states. So basically, the size of a Taylor Swift concert determined the outcome of the election. This is critically important. And yet, Donald Trump is up in 5 out of the 6. It's devastating. The president trails by an average of 48 to 44%, 4 percentage points on average. The majority of voters are saying that President Biden's policies have personally hurt them. The survey also reveals the extent to which the multiracial and multi-generational coalition that elected President Biden is fraying. Demographic groups that backed Biden by landslide margins in 2020 are now far more closely contested, as 2/3 of the electorate sees the country as moving in the wrong direction. Voters under 30 favor Biden by only a single percentage point. His lead among Hispanic voters is down to single digits, and his advantage in urban areas is half of Donald Trump's edge in rural areas. And while women still favored Biden, men preferred Trump by twice as large a margin, reversing the gender advantage that had fueled many Democratic gains in recent years. This is a devastating one in terms of demographics here, which is black voters. Black voters, long a bulwark for Democrats and Joe Biden, are now registering 22% support in these states for Trump, a level unseen in presidential elections for Republican or presidential politics for Republican in modern times. Now you might be thinking, well, 22%, that's not even a quarter. It's still too much. We can't afford those sorts of margins. Add it all together, and Trump leads by 10 points in Nevada, 6 in Georgia, 5 in Arizona, 5 in Michigan, and 4 in Pennsylvania. And again, President Biden leads in Wisconsin, but by the smallest margin, 2 percentage points. It's completely unsustainable. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, is there an upshot, in all of this? Kinda, all right? Now, I want to get to it right here. Okay, so this is actually from a separate poll, a Navigator poll, right, which discussed this about a week ago. It was actually before the New York Times Siena poll came out. But basically the situation is this. Donald Trump and Joe Biden are both incredibly unpopular, even now, right? But right now, President Biden has several disadvantages going for him. Number one, he's the incumbent, right? So he actually has to defend what he's doing now. Donald Trump has the benefit, believe it or not, of 2 things. He's really not in people's faces as he used to be, because when you're the president, you're on screen more often. He's not on Twitter or X anymore. And he benefits from the American people's collective amnesia. We have a very short attention span and very short memory, okay? And we're prone to recency bias and revisionist history. We tend to do these things, and we're seeing that reflected in the polls, that people who previously despised Donald Trump are now looking back at his presidency with fondness because it's been 3 years. And we right now are seeing issues under President Biden. Now, of course, the question is, how much is Biden personally responsible for these crises? Well, that's a question that, the Biden administration is going to have to make the case. Like, listen, a lot of the problems that you're experiencing, Joe Biden is fighting to correct them, and he's also not the source of them. He inherited many of these problems, and he's fighting like hell to correct them. So give him a second term, expand his Democratic majorities, and you can expect better progress than under somebody like Donald Trump, who inherited a great scenario from Barack Obama and then drove it into the toilet in his last year in office with COVID mismanagement, Chinese tariffs, an assault on democracy. Joe Biden would never be capable of doing that. But again, you see what I'm saying? Like, Americans have largely forgotten about that, and Donald Trump isn't in their faces anymore. So what can the Biden administration do? What can the Biden campaign do? What can Democrats do? What can their surrogates do? Well, one of the biggest things is we have to point out what Biden has done well. So the Navigator poll, the most popular accomplishments of the Biden administration are lowering prescription drug costs, which we talked about, investing in infrastructure, which we've talked about, and the CHIPS Act, among others. The CHIPS Act, of course, being the boost to domestic manufacturing, particularly with semiconductor chips. It's huge. You have all these major tech firms investing billions upon billions upon billions upon billions of dollars into domestic production, creating high-paying, hundreds of thousands of high-paying, good jobs. But, as Navigator points out, even though Americans have heard the most about President Biden lowering prescription drug costs, ramping up clean energy, and investing in infrastructure, even with that, this is what they've heard about the most, fewer than 3 in 5 Americans have heard about each one. There is a disconnect between what Biden has done and done well, the facts, and the perception of the American people. And we've talked about in previous videos why that might be the case. Some of it, I'm sure, is attributable to the Biden administration and the Democratic Party, a lack of collective message discipline, the lack of willingness to brag and to spread the word about the stuff we've done right for fear that it will alienate people who are still suffering or experiencing hardships. We hear it all the time. How can we possibly talk about all the good stuff we've done when so many Americans are still struggling? That's a tough question. You have to thread that needle carefully. But facts don't speak for themselves. You can't just lower prescription drug costs, invest in infrastructure, invest in domestic manufacturing, invest in veterans' health care, create 14 million jobs, lower the unemployment rate to historic lows, lower the unemployment rate for black people to historic lows, et cetera, and so forth, going down the line, and just assume that the word gets out. That's not how it works. Facts do not speak for themselves. And I understand that there's a relationship where, politicians are supposed to be receptive to their base, right? Receptive to the constituency, be representative and reflective of that. But it's also true that representatives are supposed to lead. So they're supposed to also shape public perception. There's a feedback loop, which we've talked about. They're not simply supposed to just say, okay, this is the perception, let's deal with it. No, you actually have to work to change the perception when and where you can, at least in my opinion. We've seen Republicans do it exceptionally well, even though they don't have the facts on their side. So, communicating around Biden's accomplishments improves his net job approval rating by double digits, especially among people unfavorable to both Biden and Trump, younger Americans and college-educated women. People who are unfavorable to both presidents are called double haters, okay? And there are a lot of them, people who don't want Trump or Biden. But when you tell them, people who don't like Trump or Biden, about Biden's accomplishments, according to Navigator, it improves his job approval by double digits. Like, hey, here are your two options. I know you don't like either, but this one, the Joe Biden one, Joe Biden has actually done things for the American people, which has impacted you positively, which will impact you positively. This is what he's done, and it actually creates a shift in preference. Messaging is huge, and it's not just the burden of President Biden. That's the other thing. Even this channel with its 40,000 subscribers, not really a lot in the grand scheme of things, we have an obligation, you and I and every one of us, on camera, off camera, in private conversation, in text messages, in message board debates, perhaps diplomatically, even at Thanksgiving dinner, we have an obligation to spread the word when and where we can. This is vital, folks. We have a year, 1 year, to get this right. Because as we've discussed in previous videos, and as we will continue to discuss, the stakes are impossibly high. Donald Trump has vowed, openly vowed, not once, not twice, multiple times, a second administration of vengeance. He intends to go after officials who disagreed with him, his critics in the media. He has openly called on Republican attorneys general and district attorneys and people in charge of law enforcement who skew right to prosecute and persecute his political enemy, because he says that he's being persecuted by the left. It's not true. Even if it were true, it wouldn't justify a tit for tat. But he's openly calling for it. Joe Biden has never even suggested that. Donald Trump, if he gets a second term, is going to unleash vengeance against those whom he sees as enemies. And you can't trust this man's judgment. He's not going to merely confine it to Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden. Anybody who criticizes Donald Trump, anybody who disagrees with Donald Trump, anybody who in any way doesn't serve Donald Trump like a sycophant is Donald Trump's enemy in his estimation. Republicans have shown no willingness to check him because it's a cult of personality. And the other thing I'll say, I debated whether or not I was going to play this clip, but I think I'm going to because it's really important. I want you to hear what Bernie Sanders has to say. Okay, this is in response to a slightly different context. It's about Israel and Palestine, which, by the way, criticism of how President Biden has handled the response to the war between Israel and Hamas is eroding his support with the Democratic base. But Bernie Sanders, who is arguably the most progressive, major progressive politician in the United States, this is what he has to say about a comparison effectively between Joe Biden and Donald Trump and the Republican Party.
What's going on right now is a horror show. We don't have to quibble about words. Thousands of men, women, and children are being killed. It has got to end right now. And one of the things that concerns me, Donna, is there has not been enough talk about what right-wing Republicans are doing right now. They don't want any aid to go to the Palestinians. Somebody should be talking about that. Somebody should be talking about how Trump wants to expel Palestinians from this country. So it's, you can disagree with Joe Biden, but on his worst day, he'll be 100 times better than where Trump and the right-wing Republicans.
So you think that Rashida Tlaib should...
There you have it. Even Bernie Sanders, and the logic that Bernie Sanders is using, that statement that even on his worst day, Joe Biden is 100 times better than Donald Trump and the Republican Party, that's not just on the matter of Israel and Palestine and Hamas. It's on every major issue. I'm not asking you if you have legitimate grievances with the president to ignore them. I'm not asking you to pretend they don't exist. I'm asking you to put them in a context. Do you really believe that a malignant narcissist, a pathological liar like Donald Trump, somebody, again, who has openly vowed vengeance and the acquisition of power. Remember, he wants to erode separation of powers to hoard executive power unto himself. A guy who says that if elections are free and fair, Republicans will never win another election again. Thinking about all of that, appointing right-wing Supreme Court justices which erode your civil liberties, paving the way to 6-week abortion bans or no exception abortion bans, whatever the issue is, to say nothing of what he's done to democracy. Again, an attempted insurrection. He still hasn't conceded the previous election. We have no reason to believe that he would concede this election. So, are you really willing to risk a second Trump presidency because of your grievances with President Biden, your legitimate complaints with President Biden? That's a personal question people have to ask. And you and I, those of us who do prefer Biden to Trump, Democrats to Republicans, the left to the right, we have to make the case that there is a harm reductionist angle there. That if you're given a choice between two imperfect choices, you are morally obligated for yourselves and others to pick the least imperfect choice. As far as I'm concerned, that's Joe Biden, it's the Democrats, that's the left in general. You let me know what you think in the comments section. Again, don't want to scare you, but we have to take this seriously, and we have 1 year to course correct. Let me know what you think in the comments.